I've always wanted a successful zoo, but I'm scared of animals. So instead, I hired a homeless New Yorker to round up a few diseased rats, and I'll use those to make my zoo. Can I make $100,000 in Planet Zoo without ever curing these diseased rats? Join me to find out. This is the story of Rat Town. But before I could bring in my rats, I needed to set up the basic groundwork for my zoo. I'm not gonna have much income no matter what I do, so there are a few key things I need to focus on to make sure this is a success. These are keeping the rats living in technically humane conditions, keeping guests happy, and cutting costs to maximize profit in every conceivable way, no matter how scummy. So, let's start with the first and build the rat's new enclosure. I need to make sure it meets humane condition requirements, otherwise protesters will arrive and it'll slash the park's income, which could easily become fatal to the zoo. I decided to use glass walls as they're cheap and probably pretty sturdy, and people can see in from all angles. There's no risk of the rats jumping walls or anything, so security really isn't a problem. I'm going for cost here. I'm also giving them plenty of space to run around. They may not be able to move pretty soon on account of the terminal illness I won't cure, but they sure can look at all that land, and that's good enough for protesters to not show up. There, that looks like a perfect rectangular enclosure to me. Next, I built a very short path between the entrance and the rat enclosure. There's no need for an extensive path system here since there's only one exhibit. I also built a circle around the rat enclosure just to ensure everyone who wants to see the rats can see them. This is a super easy way to increase the average guest's mood and get them to spend more money. I also put trash bins and benches around the park. These will help keep the park mostly clean without needing additional janitors. Like I said, this park is all about efficiency. I can't afford to spend a single extra dime. I also hired a few basic staff members to keep this place running, 4 to be specific. I hired a keeper to clean, a caretaker to give the rats food and water, an educator to teach people about rats, and a veterinarian who I quickly realized was obsolete here and would have nothing to do, so I promptly fired them their first day on the job. On a separate path, I constructed a little staff area for everyone to reside. Important note, in this game, guests don't see staff as people. They see them as inconveniences that should be out of their sight at all times. So if a guest sees a staff building, they become furious and filled with hatred. For this reason, I've relocated the staff members to their own depressing side path over here. Nothing too interesting, just a couple of mandatory buildings, that kind of stuff. With the sickening staff moved out of the way, it was time to start optimizing my income. To give guests a bit of variety and increase total spending, I put down 3 crappy food stands that sell baked goods, burgers, and soda. All of them will probably give people food poisoning, but I'm trying to turn a profit, not make a good zoo. And if they can't trace it back to me, it's not my problem. I also put some toilet blocks in to help in case said food poisoning hits a little earlier than expected. And it also increases guest satisfaction for only a couple $100, so it's just a good deal. I added a few decorative bushes and hid some ambient speakers in them to trick guests into thinking there are a few other animals at this park other than rats. So hopefully that makes them 1% less depressed while they're here. Another thing I did to trick guests was install fake security cameras. These do nothing as they aren't plugged in, and I'm not going to hire a security guard to enforce anything, but they will make guests feel like they're going to get in trouble if they commit crimes, and that will lower the overall crime rate and help avoid things getting vandalized like benches. Then to squeeze every last dime out of these people, I had the audacity to make the first thing customers see when they enter an ATM and a donation bin in the hopes they'll donate before realizing this is the Wonka experience of zoos. Finally, I ordered all 7 rats, and while I can't force them to come with diseases, as long as they hang out here for a while, they'll contract one pretty quick. It was time for the grand opening and to release my rats into their new home. Look at them, they're incredible. Oh, you can't see them? Let me zoom in a bit. There. That's what these people are paying to see. I know, worth every penny. I even made the zoo open 24 hours to ensure guests can see this wonder any time of day. There aren't lights in the park, or electricity for that matter, but I'm sure they'll figure something out. With the rats in place, somehow things were actually going decently well. People flooded into the zoo upon the grand opening. They were eating the food, they were looking at the rats, they were using the bathroom. It was exactly like I envisioned it. All of my cost-saving tactics combined with trying to squeeze out every last cent from these people was actually working. And while the rats were healthy, I was turning a profit. I was able to quickly cross over the $25,000 threshold before the first problem showed up. The main first hurdle the zoo would have to face would be its first inspection. Inspectors will come every year or so to make sure the zoo is treating its animals well and is overall in serviceable condition. If any problems are spotted, I will be fined $750 per problem. This fine can be given for a variety of things, such as having protesters in the park or animals with their needs unmet. After the inspector did their rounds, I was able to barely pass the first first inspection. The rats had absolutely nothing for enrichment or mental health, but they had enough space and none of them were thirsty or hungry, and that's good enough for me. Guests were actually having fun, somehow. Considering this zoo was 3 stands of terrible food and borderline invisible rats, it's a miracle anyone showed up at all, let alone paid for it and enjoyed themselves. But before I knew it, the first disease had set in, and it was only a matter of time before the plague would start. Just kidding, because something way worse than disease happened instead. Turns out the entire time the rats have been here, which has been for over a year, they have not been given water once. Which, surprise surprise, is way worse than getting sick, so they were all starting to drop dead from dehydration. At the exact same time, the glass barrier I constructed at the very beginning decided it didn't want to function anymore and spontaneously shattered. Sure, maybe I didn't hire an engineer to upkeep the place because it was too expensive, but what kind of glass shatters after a year or two? Never mind. With the disaster underway, I went about containment as best I could. I repaired the barriers and placed a water bowl for the rats to have water routinely delivered to them from then on. Unfortunately, there wasn't anything I could do about the escaped rats or the protesters there for their well-being. I couldn't afford to capture them, so I just let them die of starvation or disease in the wild. And once the escaped rats were dead, the protesters left with them. But they left their mark. When inspection time rolled around and there were loose rats running around the park and protesters stomping on them, the inspector was not happy. And I got fined over $2,000 from just one inspection. And that happened a couple times. In total, I suffered a huge financial blow from this and lost almost $5,000, which may not sound like much, but that's more than I'm making in a year. But it wasn't over. One singular rat remained in its cage, the sole survivor of the travesty. Unfortunately, this rat was nearing the end of its natural life, as they only live for around 6 years, which made me realize I definitely couldn't do this with only 7 rats, since they wouldn't live long enough for me to make enough money. You'll see what I mean when you see how long this took. White flag raised, I bought a couple more rats. But that wasn't the end of my troubles. If all of my rats die when there aren't any for sale, the zoo will instantly fall into ruin. Also, it was a good thing I chose to buy more rats because literally the second I purchased them, the previous rat died of old age. The only one of the initial 7 to die of natural causes. After some more time passed, I had made around $50,000, which you may think is the halfway point, but it really wasn't. The longer this zoo exists, the more likely that I'm gonna run out of rats and fall into ruin. So I had to start reinvesting my money and strategizing. I invested into a monorail to take guests in a circle around the rat enclosure. I wasn't planning to profit much off the monorail itself since it's an extremely costly investment. However, what it does do is trap guests in the park while they wait in line for it. This means that once they leave the monorail, not only will they be happier since the park has more varied activities, they will be more likely to be thirsty or hungry. And since the monorail spits them out near the back of the rat exhibit, they can't leave the park without walking by those oh-so-tempting food stands, hopefully earning me a couple extra bucks. This plan worked pretty well. The monorail caused the park's average guest count to skyrocket, and at some points I would have over 300 guests in the zoo at a time, when before I was hovering around the 150 mark. This also massively spiked the amount of people who wanted to buy food or drinks, and my stands were flooded with customers. Because of the increased demand, I was able to open up another burger and drink spot, and they both had a constant swarm of hungry guests feeding more money into the zoo. It was a good thing the park was starting to make more money, because now the rats had time to settle in without dying of dehydration. Disease was beginning to run rampant. In an effort to avoid running out of rats, I purchased a ton of rats whenever they were available and ended up with 7 rats at one point. Huge mistake. Instead of giving me a better chance of not running out of rats, it just meant that every single rat got infected with one of the many different diseases. There were a ton of them going around, but cowpox was the most common, and the rats would get severely infected and spread it to every other rat. But for some reason, the disease never actually resulted in death, which would have been better for me. For every rat that had a disease, the inspector would charge me $750. That doesn't sound like much, but this park is making around $1,000 on a good month, and these inspectors come 1 or 2 times per year. So having this many rats meant the zoo was no longer profitable, and I had no way to get rid of them. I simply had to wait for the rats to die of natural causes, and by the time I was profitable again, I had lost almost $10,000. This taught me the ideal strategy is to only have 2 rats at a time. Guests don't actually seem to care all that much how many rats I have. They also don't care if it's diseased or not. Since diseased rats cost so much more than healthy rats, whenever I get a diseased rat, I can simply let it die along with any other rats that got infected. And right when the final infected rat is about to die, I can purchase a new, healthy rat that's less likely to get sick to minimize the fines I have to pay for my poor sanitation conditions. I would just kill the rats, but I would need another animal to do that, and that's against the rules. As a result of this plan, it came with the risk that all the rats would die and I wouldn't be able to buy a replacement. But with how much money I was losing by having excess rats, I had no choice but to bite the bullet and accept the risk. In the end, this plan was a huge success. Combined with the extra guests from the monorail, I was making almost $5,000 a year, which is practically nothing for a zoo, but it was good for what I'm working with. After a few more years, I crossed over the $75,000 line, and the smell of victory was growing ever stronger. Things weren't perfect though, and I still needed to perform upkeep for everything to function smoothly, and I wasn't doing the best job. For example, the monorail broke down and guests were trapped on it for about a year before I noticed, and they were not happy. So I also hired a mechanic to fix everything that broke in the park before immediately firing him. I also made a discovery about the educator I hired at the very beginning. Turns out, all he's been doing is walking around just occasionally telling people about rats, and I've been paying him the same amount as an engineer. The average education of my guests is still 0%, so is he just lying to them? I have no idea, but needless to say, I fired him immediately. As a result of having no consistent engineer, however, I was having to constantly manually repair the rat enclosure, and they may have escaped a few times, causing protesters to show up and causing me to get fined for the protesters showing up. Despite those hiccups, my strategy worked flawlessly. The park had entered a pretty solid flow state. Inspectors would come, but I never got fined for the rats being diseased for some reason. Maybe since rats are usually diseased, it just wasn't that important. Protesters didn't seem to care all that much either. They only cared whenever I accidentally let a rat out of its cage or didn't feed or water it. I had expected a bit more trouble in the final lap, but it seems all the strategies I came up with were enough. I kept my rat numbers low and let diseased rats die out, and was able to coast along and maintain profitability until I finally hit that grand $100,000 mark. In celebration, I destroyed the barriers and let my rats roam free. And that is how I turned Rat Town into a thriving zoo. And it only took me 46 years, meaning I made a whopping 20 cents an hour. Now that is what I call a lucrative side hustle. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, subscribe for more stuff like this in the future.